This is Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Good evening, listener. I'm Steve Taylor, your host to a horror anthology podcast where we ask you to depart from your safe perception of reality to descend with us into the frightening depths and dark corners of twisted imaginations. With carefully curated original tales of terror each week, our deepest rooted fears are brought to the forefront by a diverse cast of voice talent and masterfully eerie sound design that bring these stories to life. We'll give you tales of unnerving encounters with the occult, harrowing hauntings, and sinister seances that show just how darkness knows no bounds. Make sure to check out Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Lifelong friends 19-year-old Calvin Parker and 42-year-old Charles Hickson hung out together whenever they could. One of their favorite things to do together was to fish. There was nothing better than a fishing pole in one hand and a drink in the other. And it should have been a normal and relaxing night for the two friends. But something happened. Something so horrifying that one of them spent the rest of his life trying to run away from it. Here's a story of a bizarre alien abduction, the mystery that followed for a very long time. And now, finally, some answers. My name is Edwin. And here's a horror story. Charles, or Charlie, Hickson and Calvin Parker met in 1964, when Calvin was only 10 years old. He was friends with Eddie, Charlie's oldest son. Now, Charlie became a father figure and a friend to Calvin because he would spend a lot of his childhood hanging out with the Hickson family until they moved 100 miles away to Pascagoula, Mississippi. After some time, Calvin's father started taking fishing trips to Pascagoula and they reconnected with Charlie. Soon, Calvin continued these trips to Pascagoula without his dad. Eddie, Charles' oldest son, left for Vietnam in 1972, and during these fishing trips, Calvin and Charlie grew closer together. In 1973, Calvin was 19 years old and ready to be a real man. He was about to marry the love of his life, but he wanted to make more money first. So Charlie offered him a job where he worked, down in Pascagoula, and Calvin accepted. He moved into Eddie's empty room and started working that same day he moved in. His fiancée stayed behind so they could save some more money for the wedding. Charlie and Calvin drove to and from work together every day. After work one night, Charlie asked Calvin if he wanted to join him for some fishing. Calvin was hesitant. He thought there would be too many bugs, but Charlie insisted. He had bug spray to keep them away, and Calvin agreed. So they left work together at 5:45 p.m. They got into Calvin's yellow station wagon and headed to Pascagoula River. It was late in the evening on October 11th, 1973. The sky was clear, not a single cloud in the night sky. They found a log to sit on, but moved around different areas of the river, trying to find the perfect spot. When they did find the right one, they sat down and began fishing. Charlie was trying hard to get a bite, while Calvin was just sitting back, enjoying his beer. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for them until Calvin noticed something. A blue light in the corner of his eye. He thought that the police had shown to remove them from the area. They weren't supposed to be there. It was private property. But when they turned to look, something was weird about these lights. They weren't flashing like police lights, and there were no sirens. If it was the police, they would have identified themselves, right? And so Calvin and Charlie were confused and scared. They watched as a bright blue light circled around them. And then, the lights floated into a spot in the river and continued to move in circles. Neither one of them had seen anything like this. It was so quiet, except for this faint hissing sound. And it just got louder and louder. And they looked at the lights, trying to figure out where the hissing was coming from. And as they stared, a blinding light came from the sky. When they could finally see again, a large object came into view. It was football-shaped and metal. It must have been about 80 feet long, and it was hovering above the river. The craft hissed, but the water below it was perfectly still. Calvin turned to Charlie and asked, "You're seeing this too, right?" Charlie didn't answer. He was frozen in fear. He didn't need to say it out loud. His shocked face said it all. He was seeing it too. This was really there and right in front of them. The ship hovered above them, and after what felt like an eternity, there was another blinding light coming from the ship. Only this time, it was white. In fact, it was so bright that it hurt their eyes to look at it. And then 3 people floated off the craft. Only the closer that they got, the more Calvin and Charlie could see that these were not humans. They were the size of men, but with smaller bullet-shaped heads and broader shoulders. They had no necks. Their skin was gray and wrinkled, so wrinkled that it was hard to see if they had eyes. Where there should have been ears, there was a nose. It was a triangle-shaped thing, but with no nostrils. And instead of 2 legs, the beings appeared to have 1 scrunched-up leg. And they were about 5 feet tall. These things were moving toward Calvin and Charlie, and they were moving fast. And by the way, by this time, Calvin and Charlie are still standing in that same spot, frozen in fear. One of the beings went for Calvin, and the other 2 went for Charlie. The men could not move. And so one of the creatures raised his claw-like hand and touched Calvin, and Calvin felt a sting and immediately felt numb. He believed he was injected with something. Maybe it was something to calm them down or make them defenseless. The creatures did the same thing to Charlie and then picked the 2 men off the ground. They headed to the white light and all floated up, disappearing into the light. They were floating into the ship, paralyzed and unable to stop what was happening. Once they were on the ship, the creatures separated the men. Charlie couldn't see anything, just an overpowering white glowing light. Where were they? And where was Calvin? Calvin happened to be in another small room. He was placed on a table in the middle of it. He was propped up at a 45-degree angle. He could not move. He could only watch as the creatures moved him around. And then he saw a tiny blue box hovering over him. It moved back and forth, in and out of his eyesight. It was as small as a deck of cards, and sometimes it paused, and it clicked, before it continued to fly around. Before the small blue box, another being came into the room. It was 5 feet tall, with gray skin, just like the 3 things that carried them into the ship. But this one had big brown eyes, and it was less wrinkled. It looked more human than the other 3, and it scared Calvin a little bit less. He then heard that familiar buzzing hiss, and the creature said, "Don't be afraid." In a different part of the ship, Charlie was in a similar situation, paralyzed and stuck on what looked like an exam table. The beings positioned him and moved him around. He was examined by a machine. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. It was out of this world. In his own words, quote, "There ain't no way to describe it. It looked like an eye, like a big eye. It had some kind of attachment to it. It moved. It looked like a big eye, and then it went all over my body, up and down. And then they left me." The eye disappeared into the wall. He was floated off the table, and then he saw a dark patch. He saw his tackle box, and there was Calvin. He looked so scared. Charlie had never seen Calvin look so horrified. The being set Charlie on the ground, and as soon as they let go of him, he fell face first on the dirt. Charlie got up and walked Calvin. They both heard a buzzing whoosh. The lights were gone. The night was silent. It was just the 2 of them again. Charlie then felt a strange sensation, like a radio signal that was turned on inside of his head. Something said, "We are peaceful. We meant you no harm." He turned to Calvin, and there was a look on Calvin's face that Charlie did recognize. You see, Charlie spent time in Korea and knew what shell shock looked like. His young friend was in shock. He shook Charlie, trying to snap him out of it. Calvin screamed and fell to the ground. They sat on the ground together, and they had no idea how much time had passed. They didn't know what those things were. They didn't know why they were taken. They only knew one thing, that they had to keep this between themselves. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, would believe them. People would call them crazy. And so the men hiked the trail through the woods until they found Calvin's car again, and neither of them spoke a word. The silence was broken by the sound of Charlie opening the car door. There was glass everywhere. Something had shattered every window, and on top of that, the car had trouble starting, even though it was working just fine on the way to the river. Charlie fumbled through Calvin's car until he found a liquor bottle under the seat. He downed 3 shots and offered some to Calvin, but Calvin declined. Nothing could help his nerves right now. And they drove away, confused, scared, and quiet. They stopped at the Mississippi Press building to see if anyone could tell them what time it was. Neither of them had a watch. The building was deserted. It must have been pretty late. So they just continued the drive to Charlie's place, but stopped at a bar to gather their nerves. Calvin and Charlie sat, nervous and speechless. Finally, Charlie broke the silence. He wasn't sure that he could keep this to himself. And after some back and forth, and with some insisting, the pair decided to inform the authorities. Charlie volunteered to make the call since he was the oldest of the two. Maybe, just maybe, they would believe him. They got back in the car and drove to a payphone. Charlie dialed Keesler Air Force Base. He heard the Air Force took care of these kinds of things. But the woman who answered told him that the Air Force did not have anything to do with unidentified flying objects. She just told him to call their local sheriff department, and Charlie agreed. But Calvin didn't want to. Charlie just had 2 drinks and Calvin thought they would be laughed at. And sure, there were only 2 drinks, but the alcohol had a strong smell. But still, Charlie insisted and made the call. The deputy was amused but told them to stay where they were. They were going to be picked up by an officer and brought back to the station. The men were questioned separately and then placed together in the interrogation room. That room was bugged. Officers could hear everything without Charlie and Calvin knowing. The officers expected to hear the pair drop the act, but Charlie and Calvin did not. The two were talking over each other and they were both very scared.
Sir? Yes.
Charlie was trying to calm Calvin down. Calvin was terrified that if he told police what happened, the creatures would come back for him. He was going to lose his mind. And in his own words, I got to get home and get to bed and take some nervous pills or something, see a doctor or something. I can't stand this. I'm about to go all to pieces. I can't sleep like it is. I'm damn near crazy. The men were released around 11 p.m. But before leaving, Charlie demanded the sheriff for this to be kept quiet. He didn't want the press to hear about it. They got home and neither of them could sleep that night. Breakfast before work was quiet too. Calvin wasn't sure if Charlie had told his wife about what had happened the night before. They drove to work together and Charlie, again, broke the silence. He asked Calvin if they should be checked medically to make sure they hadn't gotten some sort of bacteria or radiation from the ship. Calvin told Charlie not to worry about it. He just wanted to go back to work, back to normal, back to pretending that this had never happened. But their lives had already been changed. Forever. Up next, the story begins to spread. I'll tell you all about it up next. Stay with me. Somehow, journalists heard about the alien abduction. The calls to the factory where they worked were non-stop. The phone would just not stop ringing. It was so disruptive that their boss kicked them out and sent them to the police station. The sheriff then decided to take them to Keesler Air Force Base. That's right, the same place that said they couldn't help Charlie and Calvin on the night they were taken. When they got to the Air Force Base, men in radiation suits met Charlie and Calvin. They were taken to a room where the two were examined. After the examination, they were declared radiation-free. Then, before they could feel relief, another man took them to a different room. There, Calvin and Charlie were questioned by 6 men. 5 of the men were in military uniforms, and the 6th man, the one who did most of the talking, was in a black suit. The man in black had them sign a paper. He told them it was minutes to their meeting, but the pair never received a copy of this paper. After this, the pair were approached by 2 psychiatrists who wanted to try hypnosis on them. Calvin and Charlie didn't want to try it at first, but they eventually agreed. Charlie was first, and it went okay. Charlie told them the same story he had told the cops. Calvin was next, and during his session, he screamed and cried. It didn't go well. The psychiatrist believed both men had really experienced something traumatic. The two then returned home. They just wanted a normal life and to forget about it all, at least in the beginning. You see, Calvin moved out of his old friend's house. He laid low, waiting for his wedding and to start a family. And one night, he was shocked to see that Charlie went on a nearby local news channel. Charlie was sharing their story. Calvin, of course, felt angry and betrayed. They had agreed to move on and to no longer talk about that night in 1973. Calvin needed to stay away from Charlie. He had no interest in reliving the traumatic night. This is how their lives went on now, separately. Charlie continued to talk to whoever would listen, and Calvin would just stay quiet. He was unable to move on, and the aliens didn't let him move on either. In January of 1974, Charlie needed to get away from all the media attention. He went on a solo squirrel hunting trip against his wife's wishes. She was worried about Charlie, especially after everything he had been through. She only agreed after he promised to bring back enough squirrels for some soup, but when he returned that evening, he had no squirrels. His hunting trip was interrupted. As he was ready to trap his prey, he felt like something was off. It was too quiet. And then he felt a familiar buzz. He looked over to some trees and saw the same craft from the night of October 11th, 1973. It was hovering above the trees. He felt like a radio turned on in his head and he heard them. They promised to return. But this time, he wasn't scared. He felt comforted. 1 month after the incident during his hunting trip, Charlie heard them again. It was early in the morning and a loud bark woke him up. He didn't want the barking to wake up his wife, so he got up to investigate. He went outside and followed the dog to an alley, where the dog disappeared. And then he heard that familiar buzz, and again, like there was a radio in his head, he heard, "We mean you no harm. You have been chosen. There is no need for fear. We will communicate again." 1 month later, in February, he heard them again. "You must tell the world we mean no harm. Your world needs help. We will help in the future before it's too late. You are not prepared. We will return soon." And the aliens kept their word. A few months later, in May of that year, the Hickson family was visiting Charlie's grandparents in Sandersville, Mississippi. There were 8 passengers in total. On the way back to Pascagoula, Charlie's son, Kurtz, saw a strange light in the sky. A star that seemed to be a lot brighter than the rest of the stars. Charlie knew it right away. It was another ship. This one was bigger than the one he and Calvin saw together in October. And then it got closer. It was moving parallel to the Hicksons. Kevin, Charlie's son-in-law, slammed on the brakes. Kevin was scared they were going to crash with the craft. Everyone in the car was yelling, everyone but Charlie. He felt like he was being pulled to the ship. He was trying to get out of the car. His wife and daughter were yelling for him not to leave, but he needed to go. And then he heard it again. The radio signal and a voice. Go. There will be another time. Another place. But it never came. Charlie never heard from the aliens again. Charlie kept talking about that night he was taken. He went to conventions, radio shows, and he even wrote a book about what happened to him. Calvin, on the other hand, said nothing. He joined the Marines in 1974 to get away from everything. The night was simply too traumatizing for him. And when he did talk about that night, he was called crazy and a liar. So he didn't want to say anything. And he stayed quiet until 2019, 7 years after Charlie died. And of course, skeptics latched onto Calvin's book as evidence that this is all a lie. They were pointing out all of the differences between Calvin's book and what Charlie had said in the past. Some say the two fantasized the whole encounter in a hypnagogic state, which is something like a waking, dreamlike state. Despite the skeptics, after Calvin's book, more witnesses came forward. They were inspired by him and no longer afraid of being judged. On the night of October 11th, 1973, the Pascagoula police received 50 phone calls. All of the phone calls were people claiming to have seen something in the sky. One of those people was Maria Blair. That same night, she had been waiting near the Pascagoula River with her husband, not far from where Charlie and Calvin were taken. Maria's husband was supposed to leave on a boat to do some work offshore, but it was taking a long time to arrive. Longer than they had expected. And while they waited, her husband fell asleep. Maria was dozing off too. And then she saw a strange blue light. It looked just like the light that Calvin and Charlie had seen that night. There was only one difference. This one was moving back and forth across the sky, like it was tracing a pattern. She just dismissed it. Maybe she was just dreaming. She was just about to fall asleep, after all. And Maria didn't even bother telling her husband until the next morning when she saw Calvin and Charlie's story plastered all over the news. Her husband begged her to keep it to herself. He didn't want anyone thinking she was crazy. And she did for almost 45 years. That's until she saw Calvin's book. And after 4 decades, he was finally speaking out about his experience. She could finally get it off her chest too. She thought that maybe her story would help others see that Calvin and Charlie were telling the truth. They weren't crazy. She wasn't crazy.
We were in a 69 GTO, and we were waiting on the captain of the boat, crew boat, to come out because he was going out on the boat. Noticed a blue light come up in the sky over there, and then I seen it start going. It was following the riverbank, the river here, and it would go so far down, and then it would turn around, and it would come back. And then finally I didn't see it anymore.
And it wasn't just Maria Blair and her husband. And it wasn't just October 11th either. On October 7th, 3 days before Charlie and Calvin were abducted, there was another sighting. Sheriff Charles Delk was watching the show Columbo when he got a call. It was around 8 p.m. Dispatch called Sheriff Delk, letting him know a woman had called and talked about a strange flying object with blue lights. He dismissed it as another crazy person calling. But a few minutes later, dispatch reached out again. The woman had called once more, and she sounded more distressed than the first call. He didn't want to, but he went to his car and drove to the woman's house. He looked around and saw nothing. He let her know that they would look into the sighting, and so he went back to his car and started to drive away. But he didn't get far. Something in the trees distracted him. It was a large object, shaped like a spinning top. It moved at about 25 miles per hour and had flashing yellow lights. Sheriff Delk radioed dispatch. He let them know that the object was in sight and he was following it. He followed for like 5 miles, but then it stopped over something that looked like a power station. The object hissed, shot out flames from its side, and disappeared into the horizon. As soon as the jets had shot out, Sheriff Delk's car stopped working. He tried to turn his car on for 15 minutes. He wanted to catch up to the object. But by the time his car finally worked, the UFO was long gone. Both men are no longer alive to tell their stories. Charlie passed away in 2011 from a heart attack, and Calvin in 2019 from kidney cancer. But that doesn't mean their stories died with them. We may never know exactly what happened that cold autumn night in 1973, but that wouldn't be the first time we're left without answers. Their encounter was not the first, and I'm sure that it will not be the last. The Earth really is nothing but a small thread in the tapestry that is the universe. And who knows? Maybe there are others out there wondering the same thing we are. Are we truly alone? This episode of Horror Story was written by Madeline Guerra with pre-production by Cristina Lumagi and hosted by me, Edwin Covarrubias. Thank you for listening to this and the other shows on Scary FM, and also for your reviews. Also, you can support the shows by trying out Scary Plus on your app for ad-free episodes. You can also find me over on Instagram and TikTok at Edwin Cove. That's EDWINCOV. Thank you very much for listening. See you soon.